In the spring of 1834, in the shadowy hollows of rural Kentucky, a pair of twin boys were born to the Holloway family, known locally for their reclusive lifestyle and whispered associations with folk remedies and backwoods mysticism. The births were difficult, a grueling ordeal attended by an aging midwife who reportedly muttered prayers under her breath that were not found in any Bible. From the moment the boys were swaddled, something about them unsettled even the most seasoned eyes. In the village, their eyes opened wide and alert, not with the innocence of newborns, but with an almost preternatural awareness. The first signs of their uncanny connection emerged within weeks. When one cried, the other followed, not in tandem but imperfect, synchronous, same pitch, same intervals, same choking silence between gasps. Neighbors attributed it to the usual strangeness of twins, yet their mother, Abigail Holloway, knew differently. She documented the occurrences in a leather-bound journal that would only surface generations later, its pages yellowed and ink smudged with age, but still legible enough to chronicle what she called a haunting symmetry that no mother should witness. As the boys grew, the strangeness only deepened. At 3 years old, one of the twins, Elias, wandered barefoot into the thickets behind their cabin and sliced his foot open on a rusted trap buried under moss and mud. As blood gushed from his foot and his cries echoed through the woods, his twin Isaac collapsed on the cabin floor, clutching his own foot and howling in identical pain. Yet Isaac bore no wound, no thorn, no blood, not even a bruise. Abigail rushed between them, helpless, unable to comprehend what she was witnessing. Over the next several years, these episodes multiplied. When Elias would catch a fever, Isaac's temperature rose with no trace of infection. When Isaac learned to carve simple shapes into bark with a knife, Elias, who had never been taught, could mirror the patterns flawlessly. They learned to walk together, to speak in tandem, and sometimes to remain utterly silent for days at a time, as if conversing through thoughts no one else could hear. By the time they reached 7, their notoriety had grown. The local doctor, a skeptical man trained in Philadelphia, made the trip to examine them after word of their episodes spread to neighboring counties. He observed one of the boys flinch violently whenever the other was pricked with a needle, despite no contact with him whatsoever. He tried separating them in different rooms, even different buildings, but the phenomenon persisted. The doctor returned to the city, disturbed and baffled, leaving behind only a terse note, anomalous sympathetic response. Beyond medical explanation, Abigail's journal grew more frantic in tone. She wrote of dreams shared between the boys, of drawings they made of places they had never visited, dark swamps, twisted trees, half-submerged shacks filled with mirrors, and of animals reacting strangely to their presence. Birds fell silent on the windowsill. Dogs growled low and deep. The family's livestock refused to eat when the twins were near. One summer, during an intense thunderstorm, Elias was struck by a falling branch while running home from the river. He was badly bruised and unconscious for hours. At that exact moment, Isaac collapsed in the kitchen, eyes rolled back, mumbling nonsense in a voice that Abigail swore sounded like two voices layered over each other, his and Elias's. When Elias regained consciousness later that evening, Isaac awoke as well, both of them speaking the same sentence at once. "It wasn't meant to hit me." The implications were too much for Abigail. She sent letters to a university in Virginia, begging for answers, but received only condescending replies about childhood trauma and imagination. Desperate, she turned to the local preacher, who visited once and never returned, his face pale and hands shaking. In his sermon the following Sunday, he warned against opening doors that heaven never intended to exist. The twins themselves never seemed frightened by their connection. If anything, they thrived in it. They often sat for hours without speaking, occasionally laughing at jokes no one else heard. They completed each other's drawings, recited each other's dreams, and often fell asleep facing the same direction, hands folded identically across their chests. There were darker moments to periods when they would not speak for days, when their eyes seemed too wide, too empty, and their movements too exact. Abigail began sleeping with the door bolted and the Bible clutched to her chest. One night she caught them standing at the foot of her bed in silence, just staring, their mouths moving without sound. When she screamed, they blinked as if awoken from sleep, apologized, and returned to bed. But she never forgot the expression on their faces, blank, knowing, and deeply ancient. Strangers came to see them. A traveling mesmerist offered to sever their spiritual tether, but left after one session, muttering about mirrors and shadows that moved without light. A professor from New York claimed to specialize in unusual neurological twins, but fled the house after finding both boys drawing an identical image of him drowning in a river, though they'd never seen him before. The drawings were dated 3 days in the future. When the man died precisely as depicted, the local sheriff demanded the drawings, only to find them mysteriously burned in Abigail's fireplace. She never admitted doing it, but the ashes in the hearth bore outlines of the same Cena hat floating downstream, a hand reaching from the water, and 2 boys on the shore with blank eyes. As they aged, their bond only intensified. One could whisper a phrase and the other would hear it, even if he was out in the field or a mile down the road. They once answered questions in unison during church school, without any visible communication. It was no longer just mimicry. It was as though they inhabited the same mental space, the same soul split between two bodies. Villagers began avoiding the Holloway farm. They whispered of curses and pacts, of inhuman spirits trapped in mortal flesh. Abigail became reclusive. She stopped attending church, boarded up windows, and forbade the boys from leaving the property. But she could not stop what was happening between them, nor could she understand it. The journal entries turned bleak, filled with fear, resignation, and questions that no science or God had yet answered. From the earliest days of their boyhood, Elias and Isaac Holloway exhibited a strange mirroring of not just behavior but experience itself. It wasn't simply that they looked alike or dressed the same, it was that their very lives seemed to unfold as a synchronized performance. When Elias picked up a hobby or developed a talent, Isaac, without any instruction or prompting, demonstrated the same ability with identical skill. When one learned to whistle, so did the other, on the same day, without being taught. When Isaac began sketching animals with uncanny anatomical precision, Elias produced drawings of similar creatures with matching technique, shading, and even peculiar stylistic flares like cross-hatching or perspective choices they had never been taught. Abigail Holloway, their mother, initially believed this to be an extension of shared environment and sibling mimicry. But it quickly became evident that something far stranger was at play. There was no explanation for how two children, kept apart for hours at a time in different parts of the property, could develop the same talents on the same day, or react to emotional or physical experiences that the other had gone through in complete isolation. When Elias accidentally touched the flame of a candle in the cellar and blistered his fingers, Isaac, who had been asleep upstairs, screamed and woke with the same fingers clutched to his chest, eyes wide in pain. Yet when examined, there was no mark on Isaac's hand, no injury, no redness, just the lingering sensation of a burn that his body did not show. The same happened months later when Isaac fell from a low branch and struck his rib against a rock. Elias, 2 miles away at the river, gasped and doubled over at the exact moment of impact, clutching his ribs and wheezing. When neighbors helped carry Isaac home, they found Elias already lying on the cabin floor, drenched in sweat, pale and repeating, "It's bruised, but not broken," over and over. Even before anyone had checked Isaac's injury, Abigail began documenting the incidents in growing detail, creating parallel timelines of events, what one boy experienced, when he experienced it, and how or whether the other reacted. The entries made less and less sense the more she wrote. The times aligned perfectly, the reactions were immediate, and the emotional states matched too closely to be mere empathy or guesswork. One day, after Elias received a beating from a neighbor's older child over a petty argument, Isaac, who had not been present and hadn't been told what happened, but spent the afternoon sulking and muttering under his breath in Elias's exact tone and phrases. When Abigail asked him why he was angry, he simply said, "Because he hit me," then blinked in confusion, as if he wasn't sure which twin he was referring to. Local townsfolk grew increasingly uneasy with the Holloway twins. Stories began circulating, stories of them answering questions before they were asked, finishing sentences no one had spoken aloud, or reacting to events they hadn't witnessed. One traveler who passed through town and spent a night near the Holloway cabin claimed to have heard 2 voices in the night, whispering the same words in perfect unison, but separated by distance. The man insisted the voices came from opposite sides of the house at once, and he left before dawn, shaken and pale. There was something else that deepened the mystery. As the twins grew older, it became clear that the shared experiences weren't always simultaneous. Sometimes, one would experience something minutes or even hours before the other, as if the event had already imprinted itself across both their consciousnesses. On one chilling occasion, Isaac began weeping during breakfast. When asked why, he could not say. 3 hours later, Elias, out in the woods trapping small game, fell into a pit left by an abandoned well, twisting his ankle and cutting his leg deeply. The time Isaac cried matched precisely the moment Elias fell, according to the sun's position and the clock in the cabin. These instances seemed less like telepathy and more like a strange distortion of time within their shared awareness. Despite being separate individuals, their skills remained mirrored throughout their childhood. When one learned to play a basic tune on a fiddle, the other could play it the next morning, having never seen or touched the instrument. Their voices harmonized instinctively. Their drawing styles, though evolving, remained eerily aligned. They each had the same quirk, tilting their heads while reading, tapping their left foot when anxious, counting ceiling boards when bored. These patterns were not taught or observed from one another. They simply emerged, as if springing from a collective source of identity. Teachers in the nearby school, which the boys briefly attended, found it impossible to test them separately. When one boy scored poorly, the other did too, even if tested on unrelated material. Their grades, handwriting, and even test answers were near duplicates. The schoolmaster, disturbed by what he could not explain, quietly suggested they be going forward. As they entered adolescence, the mirroring extended into more abstract areas: dreams, intuitions, gut instincts. They often awoke with the same imagery in their minds: a house sinking into the mud, a door opening into fire, a clock with no hands ticking louder and louder. They would look at each other with wordless recognition and say nothing more, as if the dream were a memory they both lived through. Abigail's journal revealed growing anxiety. She feared that whatever force bound her sons was not natural, not merely biological or psychological, but something elemental older than science, untouched by prayer. When she tried to confide in others, she was met with disbelief, ridicule, or frightened silence. One local woman refused to speak of the twins altogether, claiming their existence was God's mistake left uncorrected. Over time, their personalities, once slightly distinct, began to converge. Their mannerisms blended. They answered questions as one, laughed at the same moments, and seemed to grow indifferent to the concept of separation. Even when apart, they behaved as if they knew what the other was doing, thinking, or feeling. Once, when Isaac stayed overnight with a relative in another county, he startled everyone by waking in the middle of the night and yelling, "Don't step there, it's loose." The next morning, a shelf in the Holloway home collapsed under Elias's weight as he attempted to retrieve a jar from above the fireplace. The timing again matched exactly. Eventually, Abigail stopped trying to teach them separately. She found no difference in the outcome. If one read a book, the other could recite it. If one wrote a letter, the other knew what was written. There was no way to test knowledge, skill, or reaction that didn't result in perfect reflection. It was as if they had never truly been to people, only to bodies channeling a singular, inseparable force. The growing mystery of the Holloway twins began attracting attention beyond their remote Kentucky village as their inexplicable synchronicity matured into something that crossed the boundaries of both biology and psychology. Local doctors had long abandoned any attempts to explain the phenomena. Word of the twins' peculiar connection filtered through small-town rumors into letters, then into the curious hands of medical men, philosophers, and self-styled spiritualists eager to uncover the truth. In 1842, a group of physicians and scholars arrived from Cincinnati, drawn by a combination of professional skepticism and private fascination. They came with notebooks, instruments, and a firm belief that what the Holloways described was either hysteria or some poorly understood form of sibling mimicry. What they encountered shook their certainty to its core. Over the course of several days, the men conducted a battery of tests, some benign, others invasive, on the young boys, now 8 years old. They separated the twins by significant distances. Isaac was kept in the loft, above the barn, while Elias remained in the cabin under close watch. One physician pricked Elias's arm with a needle and recorded his reaction. Within seconds, Isaac, out of sight and out of earshot, clutched the same spot on his arm and cried out. The researchers repeated the process, applying slight pressure to Elias's fingers, exposing him to sudden bright light, then whispered strange words to him in Latin, hoping for a hint of suggestion or communication between the boys. With each test, Isaac mirrored the reactions, even reciting a few of the Latin phrases. Despite having never studied the language, they tried blinding both boys with cloth wraps, feeding one while fasting the other, and placing them in rooms at opposite ends of the property. Still, the same strange overlap emerged. If Elias was given a small peppermint candy, Isaac would smile and lick his lips. If Isaac was shown a terrifying image drawn from anatomy books, Elias would cry and shield his face. When asked to draw a shape without naming it aloud, Elias sketched a spiral that curved into a six-pointed star. Isaac, alone in the barn, drew the exact same pattern. These events were documented, signed by all present, and eventually published in an obscure medical pamphlet distributed to a handful of universities. Yet, even with the documented evidence, the findings were dismissed by most in the broader scientific community as an exaggeration, or worse, a fabrication born of superstition. The scholars left in frustration, their belief systems challenged but unchanged, leaving the Holloways once again alone with the burden of unexplainable truth. What science could not grasp, the townspeople began to fear more openly. Whispers turned into avoidance. Parents pulled their children away when the twins passed. Store owners stared too long, handed over goods in silence, and crossed themselves when they believed no one was looking. The Holloway family, once merely strange, became a subject of quiet dread. No one could articulate the fear precisely. It was not just the unknown, but the sense that the boys were part of something unseen, some wider mystery that resisted categorization. Abigail, increasingly isolated, stopped trying to seek help. The outside world had offered only scorn, fear, or confused reverence. Her journal during these years took on a somber, almost resigned tone. She wrote of nights when the boys would wake at exactly the same time from the same nightmare, sweating and gasping for air, speaking of the corridor of red doors or the tree with no shadow. She described moments when she would speak to one son, only to have the other turn and answer from across the room. Sometimes they answered before the question had even formed in her mouth. They no longer responded to being called individually. They came as a pair or not at all. Then came the episode that marked the end of any further inquiry. One late autumn night, Abigail was awakened by a sound that she later described as a thrumlow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing through the floorboards. When she rushed to the boys' room, she found them standing on either side of the bed, their hands stretched out but not touching, eyes closed, lips moving silently. The air felt charged, thick with some invisible weight, and her candles flickered violently though the windows were shut. When she stepped closer, both boys opened their eyes and stared at her with expressions she had never seen before. Their pupils had dilated into near blackness, their skin pale and glistening with sweat. She asked what they were doing, but neither responded. They turned, walked to their respective beds, lay down, and slept without another word. The next morning, they remembered nothing, but Abigail couldn't forget. From that point on, she began locking their room at night, though she knew it was pointless. Whatever force connected them didn't rely on doors or walls or waking consciousness. She began sleeping with a lantern lit and kept the Bible at her bedside. Her journal described how even their laughter had changed. Now it came not as individual expressions of joy, but in unison, like a single voice split in two bodies. Even the smallest details reinforced the mystery. They blinked at the same time, scratched their heads at the same moment, yawned together, turned pages simultaneously when reading from separate books. If one fell ill, the other's body would cool to the same temperature. When Isaac once suffered a bloody nose during a winter chill, Eliezer's pillow that night was stained with a similar mark, though he had no visible wound. Local folklore began, adopting their story, twisting it into cautionary tales told around fires and in beards. Children whispered that the Holloway twins could read minds, that they saw things in mirrors that others could not, that they once made a bird fall from the sky just by staring at it. The boys remained unaware of most of these stories, but occasionally they would stop mid-play and look at each other knowingly, as if they could hear the whispers floating through the trees. Abigail tried to keep their lives as ordinary as possible, reading walks along the stream, but there was no denying the weight of what they were becoming. They no longer needed to speak aloud to be understood. Their connection had evolved beyond words, beyond gestures, into a silence that carried meaning. The strange reality remained, no matter the distance, no matter the separation of experience. Elias and Isaac reflected each other not by choice or practice but by nature. It was as if a single consciousness animated two bodies, and no observer, no doctor, no scholar could separate one from the other in spirit or in experience. The incident that solidified the Holloway twins' story in the town's darker folklore occurred when one of them, Isaac, suddenly slipped into what could only be described as a waking coma. It happened on a bitter January morning. There had been no prior illness, no accident, no indication of trouble. Isaac had been eating breakfast beside Elias when his spoon slipped from his hand. His eyes went wide, and his body stiffened before slumping sideways onto the table. His chest rose and fell, shallow but steady, his eyes open yet unseeing, unfocused, not blinking. At first Abigail believed he'd fainted, but when she tried to rouse him he didn't respond. His body was limp, his expression blank, and his skin cold as if some essential fire had been extinguished. While panic surged in the cabin, Elias sat motionless, his spoon still in hand, looking forward without speaking. When Abigail turned to him, she realized his mouth was trembling slightly, his eyes glassy. When she asked what was happening, he said, "He's gone inside," though he couldn't explain what that meant. For the next 3 days, Isaac remained unresponsive, his body refusing food or water. Physicians from 2 towns over were summoned but could offer nothing beyond vague notions of catalepsy or seizure. They could not explain why his pupils reacted to light, or why his body resisted decay or stiffness. They were even more disturbed by Elias, who in that same span of time stopped speaking entirely, refused to eat, and did not sleep. Abigail kept vigil at her son's sides, moving between one who wouldn't wake and one who wouldn't speak. She noticed that Elias's body began to mimic Isaac's in strange ways, dark circles forming under his eyes, his lips cracking, and his temperature dropping. They were not symptoms of disease, but echoes. When she tried to feed Elias, he turned his head, yet when she placed the spoon near Isaac's mouth, a flicker of reaction crossed Elias's face. She wrote in her journal, "It is as if the one lives in the other now. But which is the shell and which the soul, I do not know." Then, on the 4th night, just past midnight, Isaac suddenly sat upright. His eyes blinked rapidly, his breathing deepened, and he looked around the room with confusion. Abigail rushed to him, tears streaming, asking if he was all right, but Isaac only whispered, "It's still dark in there." When asked what he meant, he simply repeated it before falling asleep. But the return of her son did not bring the comfort if she had hoped for. Though awake, Isaac was changed. He no longer walked with the same gait. He no longer finished Elias's sentences or responded to unspoken thoughts. The strange synchronicity they had always shared was broken, or perhaps only reversed. Now, Elias began to exhibit the silence and withdrawal that once belonged to Isaac. He moved more slowly, stared into corners, and on several occasions, began speaking aloud with a voice that Abigail swore was not his own. The phrases were unfamiliar, often whispered while he slept or stared at walls. "It doesn't want the light. Keep the door shut. It listens through the root cellar." The twins' connection had shifted from perfect harmony to some inverted reflection. Whatever balance had once existed between them seemed to have tilted, sending one inward and the other elsewhere entirely. Abigail tried to return life to routine. She resumed lessons, morning walks, and story readings. But the house no longer felt like a place of childhood. It felt like a stage set for something unspoken, something watching. One evening, while trying to comfort Elias during one of his long silences, she asked him gently what he was thinking. He looked up at her and said, "I remember what it looked like when Isaac wasn't breathing." She asked how he could remember that, since he hadn't seen it. Elias blinked and replied, "I was the one not breathing." As time went on, it became increasingly unclear whether the twins had resumed their old connection or if something new, something more disturbing had formed between them. They no longer needed to be in the same room to mimic each other. If Elias reached for a glass of water, Isaac would do the same 5 seconds later, even if upstairs. If Isaac turned his head suddenly during a conversation, Elias would do the same without knowing why. But there was now a delay, as though something had interrupted the channel between them, making it imperfect. Or, during one of the rare moments they both engaged in drawing again, Abigail found their sketches identical in shape but not in tone. One drawing was peaceful, a child under a tree, a house, a stream. The other was identical in outline but filled with black shading, gnarled branches, the house tilted and the stream running red. Visitors to the house began to comment on a palpable tension. The twins, once open and curious, now watched silently, speaking only when necessary. When a new preacher came to visit at Abigail's request, he noted in his journal afterward that the boys gave him the unsettling impression of one spirit divided into two conflicting halves, one desperate to speak, the other determined to remain hidden. After as he was leaving, he turned to wave goodbye and saw one of the twins watching from the upstairs window, though he couldn't remember which. What disturbed him most was that the boy never blinked, not once. Local superstition, already thick around the Holloway name, deepened. Children claimed they saw Elias walking through the woods when he was supposed to be homesick. Others said they heard 2 voices whispering near the riverbank, though no one was there. One girl swore she saw both twins in her dream the same night. She woke to a nosebleed for no reason, whether by coincidence or not. Reports of nightmares and sleepwalking in the town increased in the years following. Isaac's coma. Abigail grew older and more haunted. Her journal entries became sparse and erratic. She wrote of hearing footsteps when she was alone, of finding drawings in the twins' room that neither admitted to making. She once discovered a mirror in the barn turned to face the wall, with deep scratches along its back and muddy fingerprints on the glass. On another occasion, she awoke to find both boys standing at the foot of her bed again, silent, hands clasped. She asked what they were doing, and Elias responded, "We needed to see where we end." The twins' relationship was no longer one of innocent reflection, but of shadow and light, memory and forgetting. Whatever had happened during Isaac's mysterious descent into that unresponsive state had left a fracture, not one that broke them apart, but one that let something else into. Some evenings Abigail would see them sitting by the fire, not speaking, simply staring into the flames, their eyes reflecting a depth of thought far beyond their years. Once she overheard Isaac whisper to Elias, "I think we dreamed each other." Elias didn't respond, but after a pause, he placed his hand on his brother's shoulder and nodded slightly, both of them gazing at the hearth as though waiting for something neither of them could name. After the death of Elias Holloway, something changed in the landscape of both the house and the boy who remained. Isaac, now 17, was found sitting beside his twin's bed the morning after Elias passed, his face blank, his hands folded, as though in prayer, but his eyes dry and distant. There was no expression of shock, no outward grief, only a stillness that unsettled even the doctor called to confirm Elias's death. The physician noted that Elias had shown no signs of illness, prior no fever, no complaint of pain, no injury. His body was untouched, serene, as though he had simply chosen to stop being alive. Abigail, now a shadow of her former self, wept without end, her trembling hands covering her mouth as she kept repeating that she had known this would happen someday, but never knew what it would take with it. What became immediately evident was that Isaac was not the same boy who had sat at the table the night before. His voice changed. It became lower, quieter, more deliberate. He spoke less, and when he did, there was a kind of double cadence to his words, as if another rhythm hovered just beneath. His body language shifted. He moved like Elias had moved. He laughed like Elias had laughed, short and sharp, a sound Abigail had not heard from Isaac in years. He took to wearing his brother's coat, eating his favorite food, sitting in the chair Elias always claimed at the hearth. At first, Abigail chalked it up to mourning, a child clinging to remnants of his lost half. But then came the dreams. Isaac began waking in the middle of the night, murmuring about events from years ago, things he shouldn't have remembered, specific details of Elias's solo walks in the woods, the names of strangers only Elias had spoken with, even memories of conversations that Isaac had not been present for. When Abigail questioned him gently, he stared at her with a familiar tilt of the head and said, "You told Elias that story. You were standing by the stove. You wore the green shawl with a little tear near the collar. She had told it only once, years earlier, in the presence of Elias alone. More moments followed, dozens of them, where Isaac recalled pieces of his brother's life with the kind of precision only the dead boy should have possessed. Then came the handwriting. Abigail found a folded piece of paper in the pocket of Elias's coat, now worn by Isaac. It was a list of symbols and strange half-sentences she immediately recognized as Elias's cryptic notebook scribbles from childhood. But the paper was fresh, the ink not yet dried. When she asked Isaac where he'd gotten it, he answered that he'd written it last night so I wouldn't forget the shapes. When she showed him Elias's old journal for comparison, I said nothing, only nodded slowly as if seeing his own memories written down long ago. Isaac also began complaining of pain that moved without origin. Some mornings his knees ached so badly he couldn't stand, other days his spine hurt, or he felt breathless. These were the exact ailments Elias had begun experiencing quietly weeks before his death, but had never spoken of to anyone except Abigail. The correspondence was too exact. Doctors again came, and again they left with furrowed brows and no answers. The boy was physically healthy, and yet his symptoms matched those of someone else, someone no longer living. On more than one occasion, Abigail walked past Isaac's room and heard two voices, one soft and thoughtful, the other slightly more forceful, more curious, more like Elias had sounded at 13. But every time she opened the door, Isaac sat alone. More chilling were the episodes of memory that didn't belong to either twin. He began describing places he'd never been: an old barn with a rotted blue door, a cellar with an iron gate sealed in concrete, a library with windows blacked out by soot. He spoke of people too: an old man named Hollis who wore copper rings, a girl named Adeline with braids like rope who taught him how to trap sparrows. These names meant nothing to Abigail or anyone else in the county. Isaac said he remembered walking into a room that had no corners, only walls that curved into each other like a mouth ready to close. When asked where this place was, he answered with an expression that terrified her: "It's where I went when he died." The boy also developed an obsessive need to be near mirrors. He spent long stretches standing before them, sometimes staring, other times whispering to his reflection. Once, Abigail watched him place his hand on the glass and close his eyes, staying still for over 10 minutes. When she asked what he was doing, he replied that Elias was trying to remember something and that sometimes the mirror helped. She removed most of the mirrors in the house after that, but it made no difference. He began drawing them pages and pages of mirrors in all shapes and sizes, most cracked or shadowed by dark, impossible reflections. Soon after, Isaac began referring to himself in plural, not often, not loudly, but enough for Abigail to notice. When asked how he'd spent his afternoon, he would sometimes say, "We read," or "We were tired," or "We walked the ridge." When she questioned him, he would blink and correct himself, muttering "I mean I," but the slips became more frequent. He didn't seem distressed by them, only confused. Once, while examining a family photograph, he murmured, "That was before we were divided." It wasn't just Isaac's memories or habits that were changing. It was as though Elias's presence had not disappeared at all, but had instead moved inward, into his surviving twin, not like a ghost, but like a dormant fragment awakened. What frightened Abigail most wasn't the strangeness, but the certainty. Isaac was not guessing. He was not pretending. The way he responded, the cadence of his voice, the shift in his eyes, his sudden awareness of things he never experienced, it all pointed to something far deeper than grief or psychosis. Her journal entries became more frantic, more erratic. She wrote that she often forgot which son she was speaking to, even when it was only Isaac in the room, that sometimes he would tilt his head in just the right way and she would see Elias entirely. She dreamed of both boys standing over her bed, speaking in unison but with words she could not understand. Once, she woke to find Isaac sitting by her bed, sketching her sleeping form with incredible detail. When she asked what he was doing, he smiled and said, "He missed how you look when you dream." There came a night when Isaac stood at the edge of the woods, staring into the dark trees. Abigail called to him 3 times before he turned. When she asked what he was doing, he said he was waiting for something. "Not someone, something. It's what followed him back," he said quietly. She asked what he meant, but he simply turned and walked inside. That night she couldn't sleep. Outside, the wind howled without pattern. In the distance, a sound like 2 boys laughing echoed across the fields. But only one boy remained alive, or so she had thought.